Cheryl, how are you going with your screenplay or your book at the moment?
Yeah, well, I'm still focusing on the book, David. It's still trying to get that finished. And we're nearly finished, actually. This, one of the upsides of this, isolation is that I've been able to work with Mum quite closely, just mostly through FaceTime. So we've actually done the unexpurgated version, really. So it's almost complete. So then the next step, of course, is to see where it goes in terms of a screenplay.
Okay. Great to hear.
That's exciting. Yeah, that's exciting.
Hang on, we're just getting just a couple more people starting to join. So, hey Daryl, how you doing?
Hello, Good to see you guys.
Hi there.
I'm just allowing. I think that's everyone coming through. How you doing, Daryl? How's your screenplay coming along at the moment?
Yeah, good. I've because I'm working on a comic book with a friend of mine as well, so I was put some time into finishing those pages. So it's been on hold last week, but this week looking forward to get back into it. But yeah, done my step outline for the whole thing, and I've drafted maybe a third of the actual screenplay itself.
Okay.
Yeah, each time I sit down to do it, I'm fully engaged and love doing it. So that's a good thing at the moment.
Oh, that is always good to hear. So
yeah.
And Ian, how's your rewrite? So Ian's just sort of just finished doing I did a draft coverage of his feature, which is a really cool thriller set in Cambodia. And are you on to the next stage of the draft?
Well, I've finished the third draft.
Wow.
I've taken your remarks and I've run it past just for factual correction through through the senator in Cambodia, and he's come back and sort of tried to soften my political views.
Okay.
And he thought the name sounded a bit too much like him, so he asked me to change the name. But,
okay.
I'm hanging that one up now, and I'm moving on to next project. I'll come back and refresh myself with it. I may have to refresh it after we get these three-dimensional characters today.
Well, it is an ongoing process. I mean, my feature, I just finished the 7th draft, even though we're shooting that in about 8 weeks. We just found out we've got finance on that. But yeah, the characters have sort of gone through various stages as well, and some have come and gone, essentially using these techniques. So we'll go into that. Hey, Neil, just seen you've joined us. How you doing today?
Very well.
And whereabouts are you in the world?
Burbank, California.
Okay. Nice and hot weather there at the moment, is it?
Yeah, it's about 79. Nice.
79. So what's that in Celsius? Is that mid 20s?
Probably. Don't ask me.
Yeah.
Where's our converters? Yeah.
Great. So, okay. So, I'm just going to jump into things now. So, a couple of things I'll have at various stages. I'll have you on and off mute, just so I can keep a flow of conversation. But over in the chat group, you can put any questions or anything that pop up in there, and I'll come back to them. And there'll be a question answer at the end of the session as well. So, and if there's anything that's really pressing, you could put your hand up, and I can direct that. Get to that straight away. So make sure that we're okay. Okay, so we're going on that. Okay, so we'll jump straight into it. So we're looking at three-dimensional characters, and you're going to hear this term a lot as a writer, and you probably already have about three-dimensional characters. And it's actually a little bit misleading as a term. What we're really talking about is complex characters. So some of them will have, maybe 2 dimensions. They could be 3 or 4. And the important thing is when you're developing your characters, you want to give them more dimensions for a couple of reasons. First of all, it obviously gives you a great screenplay, and it really helps when you're actually going through and plotting your story. And the other 2 factors are directors and actors absolutely love complex characters because that gives them a lot to play around with. The director will be able to shape the performance, and the actor has a lot that they can take on when they've got these different dimensions. Because if it's just a single sort of character dimension they're playing, it just becomes the same thing for them. So as an overview, developing your characters is something that you do early in the screenwriting process. And this is something I particularly learned as a writer when I started out, and I think partly because I'm a director as well. I was focused on plotting my story. You know, what are the events that happen? And then I learned over time, it's actually the characters will dictate what the events in the story are. So that's why when I developed the One Step a Day screenplay technique, character development is actually steps 4, 5, and 6 of my screenwriting process. So we're getting in them early to develop them and then help that plot the story. So obviously in this seminar, I don't have time to go through all of those aspects in the One Step a Day screenplay for developing characters, but we're just going to focus on a couple of key areas today, and particularly the two most important characters in your screenplay, which is the protagonist and the antagonist. The techniques we're going to look at, so I'm going to go through and look at examples and also some techniques and exercises to develop those characters. But any characters in your screenplay, you actually can use these techniques to develop them. But I said, we'll just look at the protagonist and antagonist. So first of all, we'll look at the protagonist. So the protagonist is, obviously that's the main character of your story. So your screenplay is essentially the story of your character trying to achieve a goal. So protagonist will be referred to in different names. So it's a very clinical term, the protagonist, but so that might be just, you know, the main character. So if we have someone like Brad Pitt in Seven, or Paul Sheldon from Misery, Danny LaRusso in The Karate Kid, so they're sort of the main characters in the story. Or they could be a hero type character. So Luke Skywalker from Star Wars, Neo from Matrix, you know, Indiana Jones and Lara Croft from their, you know, their franchises, and obviously superhero films. Can also have an anti-hero. So this is, you know, we see them in gangster stories. So things like The Godfather and Goodfellas. And film noir in particular has anti-heroes. So if we have Double Indemnity, if anybody's seen that, which is a great film. Walter Neff in that, essentially is an anti-hero. And even Rick in Casablanca is playing an anti-hero as well. So the antagonist is the opposite character. So this character creates conflict for your protagonist. So essentially, if your protagonist has a goal they want to achieve, the antagonist has to try and stop them from achieving that goal. So we know that conflict is the key to drama, and the antagonist is going to bring that conflict. So there's different types of antagonists. We have a classic villain antagonist. So things like the witch in Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe, Darth Vader in Star Wars. They can be monster characters. So Alien, Jaws, Freddy Krueger. One of the interesting things with your antagonist when they're a monster, it's one of the antagonist characters that is not going to be complex. So Jaws can't have multiple dimensions as a character. But the key thing with the monster as an antagonist is they have to kind of love what they're doing in terms of if it's killing people or there's sort of a joy, you know, when you watch Alien, it almost enjoys killing the characters one by one. Antagonist can also be a rival character. So Belloc in Raiders of the Lost Ark, so he's a rival archaeologist who's after the same things as Indiana Jones, and Johnny from The Karate Kid as well. In love stories, the antagonist is the love interest. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a baddie or evil. It's just creating conflict. So Ilsa in Casablanca is the antagonist, and Sally in When Harry Met Sally. Obviously, there's lots of other different types as well. We just don't have time to get into all of those, but that gives a good broad picture of them. Now, the trick to creating a complex character is to give them positive and negative traits. So not all all humans are good and bad, where none of us are all good or all bad, and your characters need to be the same. And this is where a lot of screenplays fall flat when they're developing their characters, because the writer is terrified of giving negative traits to their protagonist or positive traits to their antagonist. So it just kind of feels like a really good person versus a really bad person. And there's no complexity of that as a character. And certainly your writing will start to feel really flat. So the first exercise that I use it's a really simple one, but really effective to start you thinking about these traits that the character have. And it's called a character rectangle. And so what I do, and I'll just do it on this bigger board. Hopefully if you can all see this, if that's shooting clear. And what I do is initially with my 4 traits, but I'm going to come up with 3 positive traits for the characters. So character we're going to write for this is detective character. So let's say we're writing a thriller with a detective character. And I'm going to give him 3 positive traits. So let's say with this one, he's intelligent, hardworking, and perceptive. So I'm just going to write these up. So if I'm writing them up like that, so about the writing, can we see that clearly? So we go, he's hardworking, intelligent, and perceptive. But what I'm doing is, again, they're all positive traits. I want to go with a negative trait. So in the other corner, I give them a negative trait. But this, I'm going to say, has a quick temper, so it can get really angry. Straight away we're going, that's one of his negative traits. As I develop the character, I would be giving him more of those traits in there. But automatically we kind of see he's already got 1 dimension or 2 dimensions now, because we have that negative trait that's popping up in there. And the other really good thing that this does is it suggests scenes in your screenplay, because we need to see that he is intelligent, hardworking, perceptive, and how he can have a quick temper, which actually is very similar to, who's seen Seven, one of the best films ever written? So that's a good example. Very quick temper is, and feeding off his emotions is Brad Pitt's negative trait that he has in the story. And it ends up being his downfall. So, okay, so I'm just going to list what some positive traits for a character that they can have. So we have, they're some decisive, they can be a leader, a negotiator, they can be supportive, selfless, insightful, self-aware. And some really good negative traits that we can have with characters is things like they're corrupt, violent, abusive, manipulative, addiction, liar, selfish, and the list can go on. But we see with those examples is they're really strong negatives. We're not just sort of saying they can be moody. It's someone that's manipulative and playing around with people, or those negative ones. So with the antagonist, we're actually going to do the opposite. So we're going to look at what their negative traits are. So let's say we've got the police chief. So we've got our detective, and then it's going to be our police chief. So I'm going to give the police chief 3 negative traits. So I'm going to say he's arrogant. What else we say? Is a liar. and manipulative. It's a bit hard writing on a bigger thing, so. So those three traits become arrogant, liar, and manipulative. The thing is, though, we don't want another negative trait there, except we don't want him to be all bad. Doesn't make for a good character. So what I'm going to give him as a positive trait is that he's a really good leader. And that's how he's managed to get into this position as police chief. So we go down in there, we complete leader. So that's a really simple approach. And also we now see when we've got those different traits, when those two characters of the antagonist and protagonist interact, we can start to see how they're going to come up against each other. And more importantly, it also gives us a consistency on how a character will act through the story. Because we go, that's a typical trait that they have. You know, if he's in a situation the antagonist is, we know that he can be a good leader, but we're going to see that he can be lying and manipulative. And we're going to see with our antagonist that he has this short temper. So maybe it's that clash of the manipulative and the lying and the short temper that come together in our characters. So but what I really want to stress is don't be scared to give very strong positive and negative traits to both characters. Out of all the scripts I read and give feedback on, the thing that I would most commonly see is writers are they're too scared to go, here's a negative trait, you know, my protagonist has to be really good. And they're scared, which is understandable, that if they give a negative trait to the main character, the audience isn't going to empathize or like them. In reality, there's other techniques when you're plotting your story to offset that. And also, you're going to be giving more negative traits to your antagonist, so it's going to even it out. So we're going to see these aspects of the character. We go, okay, well, the protagonist is flawed, but we also see all his positive traits, whereas the antagonist, we're sort of seeing all of his flaws. So he's always going to look worse in comparison. And I think this is particularly American TV in the last 10 to 15 years has probably done this the best with series like The Wire and Breaking Bad and Sopranos and Game of Thrones. All of those, there's no characters in that are all good or all bad. They really find that mix in them. And the worst characters are very good negotiators, or very intelligent at how they plot battles, or they really understand how humans work. So when you give them those positive and negatives, don't worry, it's not that the audience is gonna hate them. We're just gonna even them out across the story and how that plays out. So I'll just unmute if there was any questions on that initially. I think we can hear on there.
Can I ask? I've just been can they carry? You know, I mean, I'm doing a sort of family historical drama thing. So,
yeah.
Can the antagonist change? You know, I can just see it in different scenes where the conflict's going to be between different people because there's a lot of characters in the story.
Yeah.
So it would have to, you know, the focus of, I don't know, maybe episodes or, you know, scenes would be different. So, I mean, they'd probably continue on over the series, but there would be at different points, there would be different people who'd be coming in and out of the plot. So therefore, would they change? Could they change?
Yeah, it would depend on what genre is the story that you're writing.
Well, I think we said it was sort of a historical family drama, didn't we? That sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, obviously in a story you will have multiple points of antagonism. So especially when you get multiple storylines that are happening. So we see this in TV series. There's lots of different storylines that are going on.
Yeah.
So it depends a little bit on the genre you're writing in, and what what their function is normally with, I mean, I'm particularly looking at, film or longer form TV series, there still will be that singular person that they're coming up, which is the main
character. Yeah.
So, it's like any of these things that they're simple and then you find a complex way. So, for example, we look at Star Wars. Luke's got different bits of conflict along the way with the Sand People and when they're at Mos Eisley's, and even Han Solo initially seems a point of antagonism, but the two, it's like Luke Skywalker's the hero and then the villain is Darth Vader and the Emperor. So we're looking at those 2 points, and then they'll deal with other points of antagonism along the way.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good, thanks.
This empathy for the protagonist, why do you need to like the protagonist? Why can't you have Penguin against the Joker? Why can't you have two people maybe reprehensible? Why would you have to empathize with one of them?
The story, the way we track through is who we're empathizing the most with. Now, empathizing doesn't necessarily mean they're good or likable. So Don Corleone in the Godfather is a good example. He's corrupt, violent, manipulative, and is involved in all sorts of, extortion and control. But when we watch a story, we want to track a character that we empathize with. And empathize means we understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. And with that you can have lots of reprehensible characters. You just want to empathize more with the protagonist than the others around them, because otherwise then we don't care about the story. And it's a really interesting thing when people talk about, if they do or don't like films, broadly speaking, it's did they empathize with the main character or not? And a trick for that, it's a really good question, Ian. A trick for that, though, is if there are lots of reprehensible people, you just make one less reprehensible. Sorry?
Make him less reprehensible.
Yeah, and I tell you, and The Godfather is a really good example to look at, because there's an element where you kind of go, his strong characters is he's a very good leader, and he's a shrewd at making decisions, but he's not impulsive. And there's a really cool scene in The Godfather when all the families get together and they're talking about opening up the heroin trade. And the way that they make you empathize and with him more than the others is he said, we're not selling this around schools. I don't want heroin near children. And we just kind of go, so he has a higher sense of morality and what his standard is compared to all of the other Godfathers in the scenes. And also we just see how people interact with him as the leader. So that beautiful opening scene when it's his daughter's wedding and he's holding court, and everyone's coming in and asking for stuff. You watch how that scene plays out. You go, he's the center and the focus. He's the boss and the leader, and they all respect him. So even though he's essentially working out hits and corruption in that scene, we're very much drawn to him and how he uses his power.
So I had a question.
Yeah, Patrick.
If that's okay. I know we're focusing on the two main characters, but in general, for minor characters in a story, in a script, how much time should you devote to giving dimension to those minor characters who are in a scene or two, maybe important in those scenes, but they're not one of the main characters?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because balance is the key. Ultimately, your supporting characters are not going to be as complex as your main characters. So I still go through and do this work on them, and all of my character exercise, which I've got 7 that I use, I go through and do all of them, but I just won't do it in as much depth. And it's really about what their function is in the story. If they're in one scene, I might try and give them just something that keeps them, a little bit interesting. But I wouldn't kind of, for example, the film that I'm about to direct, and there's a woman who works at the hospital that has a morgue, and she's only in it for 2 scenes, and the main character just crosses paths and needs information off her. And obviously that I'm not going to break down all of the backstory and all of the different traits, but what I've just decided in the script is that she has this sort of ghoulish fascination working in a hospital. So it's actually like, oh, do you want to go down and look in the morgue, at these bodies? So we just get that little moment, and that's something that's a little bit of fun, and that I know the actress who's playing the role is going to really enjoy how you're doing that. The question just becomes balance and how much they're in the story. If it's a major supporting character, so if we have a look at something like, if we were looking at our example of Godfather again, there's quite a big past, but you'll have a look, the less time they have, the less they'll sort of be developed.
Okay, so it's proportional to their importance in the story. Makes sense.
Yeah, proportional, because they won't have a lot of screen time to be getting that.
Yeah, I guess like maybe also the secondary characters, you would kind of use them in a way to kind of show the main character's traits, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point. And so part of that is when you're working them out, that's what I would be looking at, is not just their depth, but what I need them to be doing for how the main character plays or interacts.
Right. That's a great point. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's even when you watch these different characters that pop in and out, sometimes this is the way we can show their dimensions by the way they act. So this is the point where we get to see how this person can be friendly or helpful, but then in another situation, we see how they can get angry. So what I'm going to do, just as a quick
before you move on to that, just going back to what you meant about sort of giving the actors room to work.
Yeah.
And this is quite often we're going to see the screenwriter is going to have to convey something here in the script. Now, is that something left into the action, or is it left into the dialogue? How are you getting that message across to the actor?
About what their character traits.
Well, sort of the character sort of wants to express some feeling, whatever the emotion may be. Quite often you can perhaps do it in dialogue, but do you need excessive or pretty prescriptive action notes?
Actually, what it'll come down to, the key is how they deal with situations. So it's really going to be in the drama of the scene. So part of that would become description. If you have a character that is, the way they get what they want is they talk their way into a situation. Then if they have to get into a house, for example, then they would knock on the door. So the scene description is, they knock on the door, and the dialogue's going to play out with how they talk their way into a house. But another character might go, their way to get into a house is to walk up and just kick the door in. So that scene, you don't need any dialogue. That would be a character who would just sort of walk up, then bang, kick the door, and then they go in. And those two actions on how they go about trying to get what they want will define them as a character. But that's something you would have plotted out beforehand. The description on that would, to me, those two scenarios would be, one is, my question on the first one is, how do they talk their way in to the situation to get into the house? And the second would be just, what's the physical description of how they do that? And a lot will come across as what actually the character does will define them as the character type that they are. And that's why it's particularly the next exercise that I'll get into after this, we'll look at how you get that to be a little bit more consistent all the way through, and what's appropriate, because a character talking their way in and then in a couple of scenes later smashing the door in might be inconsistent. But it also could be an escalation, maybe across the story, that the technique of talking their way into situations isn't helping, so they have to resort to this level of, how physical they get with achieving their goal. So just to have a break for a couple of minutes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give you 5 minutes. I want you to quickly sketch up a protagonist and an antagonist with the 3 positive traits for the antagonist, and 1 negative, and 3 negative and 1 positive for antagonist. You can just come up with any scenario now. It might be a doctor and a nurse, or a father and a daughter, or something like that. Just have a quick play around. It's always good to do an exercise. Okay. I'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that, and then we'll come back. Good. Okay. I'll go through, just before I get into that, back on your point, Ian, about how you describe that or how much that goes in. If you remember in the screenwriting course of mine that you did, that I said reading screenplays is one of the best ways to learn about writing. So you get some films, particularly like the ones that you're writing at the moment, if they're similar to that, and read some of the screenplays and see how they get that information across. And you'll see what comes across in description and what comes across in dialogue. And the thing is when you know your characters and it's working, it actually comes across in the scene. And that's part of the writer and the director's job is once you've put it in there, they'll find ways to express that. So, okay, we'll start, I'll work around the screen. So start with Neil. How'd you go? What's your character you've got?
Is this like both protagonist and antagonist? Okay. My protagonist is a hardworking guy. He has high moral values, but he can be tempted in certain areas. He's caring, but he has a temper. And then,
could I ask what areas he's tempted in? What is his temptations?
well, the story involves he's married, but he had in his younger days he went around with a woman who they had petty thievery and hot sex, and so she comes back into her life. She's in trouble, and he doesn't want to help her, but she's in so much trouble that he feels like he has to and remain secretive with his wife and his job. So he's like, it's a comedy.
Okay, great. I mean, that's a really good example. Temptation is, which we're going to look at later, is so important on how you can find your characters' negative traits, what they're tempted by. Excellent. And what's that's the protagonist, I take it? What's your antagonist trait?
Well, the antagonist is the woman who comes into his life. So she's, it kind of becomes a buddy movie in a sense, because he has to help her get out of this conflict. And she is seductive. She's smart. She's seemingly confident, but underneath there's a lot of lack of confidence, and she's greedy. So she gets herself involved. She kind of has a lack of judgment in certain things. So she's gotten herself in some deep trouble.
Okay, great. I always like that. Yeah, great saying. Great confidence masks great low confidence. So that's a really good one. That someone coming across confident doesn't necessarily mean they are. So that's a really cool little dimension that you can show in your screenplay. So good work on those. Patrick, how'd you go?
Yeah, so I have a sort of employee-employer relationship here, with the employee being the protagonist. Employee is genuine, knowledgeable in what they do, dependable in what they do, but at the same time not very ambitious. They just kind of sail along and do the same thing day after day. The employer is often closed-minded, duplicitous, sometimes indifferent, but can be generous at times too, surprisingly generous with compliments or even, things that he gives his employees, like throws them a party or whatever. So those are my two characters.
Great. Lots to play around with. I said, don't be scared to make them very negative and very positive traits in either one. So,
right. Maybe those are two little middle of the road, maybe?
So, I mean, I would go with, it'll also depend on what your story is because different characters will require different things. But you can play around with going, which will, the next exercise is going to help this a little bit more. So I'm sort of jumping ahead a little bit, but it's kind of like, how bad can they potentially be? We may or may not see that, but we'll jump on to that in the next exercise.
So perhaps it's that different quality, that one positive or negative quality is very, very different from the rest. Like, sort of a vast gulf between them.
Yeah, and that whole depends what, given certain circumstances, what can come of that. So we'll look at that in the next exercise. So we'll go on to Cheryl. How did you go?
Yeah, I did a husband-wife scenario, okay, and then with the wife being the
lots of
protagonist.
room for conflict there. So
Well, there's lots of room, isn't it? Never. Okay, so and you know, again, this is based on my grandmother and grandfather, really, but you know, the woman is loving and loyal, okay, good mother, hardworking, loves all her multitude of children. But she is downtrodden and resigned to this is her life, you know, poor, and you know, there's just she feels that there's nothing that she can do about it. So I think that's a negative, you know.
that, how do you describe it as a negative? So she's downtrodden? Or?
Well, downtrodden, that she just, you know, when you sort of hear about the husband, you sort of think, well, God, you know, why didn't she up and leave? But there's certainly no sense of empowerment or that she could do anything about it, okay? So
for those that also look for adjectives that will really sum it up, because it's a character, it won't just be situation, it's what's in the character. But maybe a character like that, it's about that they don't truly value themselves or they're unassertive.
Yeah.
Something like that. So we go, that would be a trait when you go into different situations.
That you could actually
that
see.
out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and that might be a character arc, how they go from low confidence, not accepting themselves, through to confidence and assertion, for example.
Well, it's true. Actually, that's what actually does happen eventually, because then, and the husband, on the other hand, is a gambler. You know, he's a womanizer. He's prejudiced, but he does love his kids.
Okay, great. Yeah. That's good. What everyone does. So.
Yeah. Well, but he loves some of them more than others as well. So he plays favourites. So that's not even a total positive, you know. Yeah.
Well, that's good. I mean, then Godfather kind of plays out like that as well. I mean, he's got his 3 sons and he has different relationships.
Yeah.
And what he thinks of them. So
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Lots to play around with those characters. So
okay, good.
Ian.
Okay. But the one I quickly thought of, set in 19th century in the goldfields through the gold rush. The protagonist is a miner and the antagonist is a police constable.
Okay, great.
The miner's hardworking, you know, he's sort of working with a friend. He's courageous. They're digging down 200 feet into the ground and with ill-supported shafts and things like that. Very dangerous job. He's also a bit of a comedian. He's amusing. He's got bright language. I suppose in his downside, he's got a drinking problem.
Okay.
Thinking is sort of, you know, he sort of tends to piss his winnings or his up against the wall.
Yeah.
The constable is probably pretty true of constables that age. Not too sure about now, but he's corrupt, he's manipulative, and he's a big physical bully. You know, he tends to want to bully people to get what he wants out of them. He's pretty hard to find a good thing, but he's a devout Catholic, so he sort of believes in family and he looks after his own family. And if he's taking money off all these people illegally, it's to the benefit of his family. So he's got a good side.
Okay, great.
Okay, and the scene could be like these people go around the leases and they bully the people into claiming they had false payments to make, and they collect the money and to their own benefit.
Okay, great. Yeah, the interesting thing on that is when you're saying it's hard to find what those good traits. There'll be stuff in there when you look around, and it might be. Has anyone seen Deadwood, the TV series? Yeah,
it's great. Yeah.
Set in the gold rush, but in the American gold rush. Elle Swearingen is an amazing character, one of my favourite TV characters, and he's kind of interesting that goes from the antagonist in season 1 to almost antagonist in season 2. But for all of the stuff that he gets up to, and his set is involved in all sorts of murder, extortion, corruption, lies, manipulations. But he's a very good negotiator. When there's those scenes when there's lots of stuff going down between the different groups in the town, and he finds a balance where everyone is happy every now and then. So he doesn't always just resort to violence. And I love watching him in those scenes because you go, this guy is the best negotiator and the best at finding a solution when he needs everybody to kind of win a little bit. And it's a great trait to watch. Whereas another example where, and this is where I think dimension will start to lack, an opposite thing of that would be TV series Get Shorty, if anyone's seen that. It was a film and then a series. Which it's quite enjoyable. Essentially, it's a gangster. He's putting a hit on someone. It's in LA, and he shoots the guy, and then he sees this screenplay on the guy's desk that he's just put a bullet in his head, and it's actually a really good screenplay. So he decides he's going to become a producer in Hollywood, and that's the setup. And what happens when you go through multiple seasons is because it's a lot of gangsters, the way they deal with everything is just to be violent. And it hits a point, by the time you get into the third season, every scenario they come up against, you go, oh, I know that violence is how they're going to solve their problem. Whereas somewhere like Alex Origin will switch between those different things. So it's a very strong positive trait that he's got for all of that other stuff. So again, really look for those good things. But the admirable said, they don't have to be necessarily a good person, but it's admirable on someone who, you know, at least if they're decisive in how they go about doing that. Okay, Daryl, lucky last, how'd you go?
Okay, so I was kind of doing it a little bit differently. I was thinking about how the character traits might fit in a film that I know, like Die Hard.
Okay, great.
What you say. So I was looking at John McClane and Hans Gruber.
Okay.
Just trying to break down their traits to see what was happening there. And I guess like, what's his name? Bruce Willis is like kind of moral. He has his moral compass. He takes action and he's perceptive.
Mm-hmm.
But I was trying to think of what his negative trait would be. And I guess maybe it's like he's a loner. Like he has a bad relationship with his wife and things like this. He's too involved in his work or something like that. So
yeah,
I don't know. Tell me if that's what you think was the...
No, those things are true, but also his negative trait in that is he's not a team player.
Yeah, a loner, right?
Yeah, so the loner bit would, and that becomes, that is his trait through there. So it's a really good observation.
Okay, and I was trying to think about like what the positive trait would be for the villain, because like I don't know, a lot of those old movies, it feels like they're just a straight up villain. But I guess like he's ruthless, he's a thief, he's cunning. But like, would his leadership be like his positive trait?
Gruber's. He's very intelligent.
He's intelligent. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
He's very organized.
Yep.
And he's also the other bit where we empathize is towards the character is the best at something.
Yep.
And you compare to all of the people that are working for him, he's clearly the leader, and leaders we gravitate towards anyway.
Sure. Okay.
And he's the other really interesting bit. It's a great example bringing that up is the difference between those two characters, because Gruber's also like the ultimate team player. He's all about a team and a structure.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
I'm a loner, but also I don't have structure.
Yep.
Rules. And what happens across the story, and this is where it's actually a really good example with character dimension. For John McClane to start to achieve his goal, he's got to become a team player who follows some rules. And that's why we have that great relationship with the police officer down in the car park.
On the ground, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hans Gruber, when stuff doesn't start to go his way, he has to become a little bit like John McClane and not necessarily working together, and he has to change his plans. He's a very regimented guy. So what happens is both of them, and this is really good character writing, the antagonist and the protagonist start to take on a little bit of each other's traits. Mm-hmm. And that's why as an action film, one of the reasons it's so good, it's the characters in Die Hard. Not to mention there's the great action set pieces, but it's those two characters. It's not just, Hans isn't, I'm a twirling moustache.
Yeah, sure.
And
there's a cool scene where they meet as well, where he's pretending to be a hostage and stuff like. So I guess
does this funny American accent? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh God, you're one of them. Oh no, don't kill me! Don't kill me! Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
God bless him.
A really good example of dramatizing those character traits that Ian brought up earlier is put him in that situation, and Hans suddenly has to improvise, and he has to do what he doesn't normally do, which is follow what the exact plan is. Because when his plan, you notice early in that film, when Hans' plan isn't going how he wants it, it starts to kind of fall apart a bit. I have my set rules that I follow. But that's also just a final point. It's a really good exercise to go through with other films and look at what those traits are, the positive and negatives, and how they play out. Because, you know, there's hundreds and hundreds of years of storytelling that you can look for examples that do them well. So good work on those. Just going to jump on to what the next exercise is. And that's a really good starting point. I really like that character rectangle, just to start getting thinking about your character traits and getting the dimension. The next thing I'm going to look at is what I call is the 6 character dimensions. So we're going to dig deeper down into our character and start to get a bit more, because that first exercise it's a good starting point to get to know your characters, but it's not going to give you enough to write your film off and build a whole character. So the 6, I'm just going to go through what the 6 dimensions are, and this is with writing a character. So the first one is presentation. So this is, how does the character present to the world? And this will be the first impression, so how we see them at the start of the story. So that character, are they energetic? Are they reserved? Are they funny? Are they serious? As we find out through the story, that might not necessarily be what their character actually is. It's how they present at the start. And this will also include things like just how they look, how they dress. You know, so this is someone, do they always wear immaculate suits? Or do they look like they're a homeless person? Now, the trick with writing, and this is a little bit more, I go into this in the step 7 and 8 of the One Step-A-Day Screenplay, and this really comes into plotting with your characters. So I can't get sort of into too much of it now, but one of the key things is really cool is how they present and what they turn out to be are often different things when you get good dimensional writing as characters. And just a really good example is Yoda in The Empire Strikes Back. So Yoda's presentation when we first meet him is, obviously we see he's this small little green, I don't know if his species is, you know, is a almost like this little kind of monster, and he's trolling, he's joking around, he seems really unserious, and what we learn about him is that he is the Jedi Master. But that's not how we see him at the start. It's just a nice little character dimension that twists. We see him at the start, and then that's what we kind of learn about him, rather than him presenting as serious right at the start. The other one, actually, just while we're on that, a good presentation in a different reality is the classic Arabian Tale story, which is the charming thief. So we meet the character at the start. They're charming. They seem like they care about the protagonist, and then it's just to lure them in to then steal from them. And it's even used in modern storytelling, going back a bit to the 90s, but has everyone seen Thelma and Louise?
Oh, yeah.
Who's the charming thief in that?
Brad Pitt?
Brad Pitt, yeah.
Brad Pitt. Just, that's a classic stuff. She set it up. You know, it's kind of like, she's gone, oh, wow, just, you know, met Brad Pitt. Charming, he's lovely, he's handsome, he looks like he's going to help us out, and he's doing all that just to steal the money. So rather than him looking like a dodgy thief at the start, we get that presentation, then we learn something about them. So the next one is, just find the notes on that. Okay. The next one I'm going to is number 2 is the character's fears. So
can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
The character's fear. So what they're scared of. And it's fear that will drive your character. And this is going to be a deep-seated fear from childhood. So it's a strong fear that will dominate aspects all the way through their life. So it might not be simply something, you know, Indiana Jones has his fear of snakes. So we have those sort of fears, but also we want to get into a deep character fear that is a very human fear that they have. So that would be things like fear of failure, fear of death, fear of losing control. So that's something like Hans Gruber. Losing control to him is his worst fear. Could be looking foolish. being abandoned. And these traits will, this fear in particular, will dictate how they play out as a character, but there could be different ways that that comes about. So if you understand what their fear is, so someone who's afraid of looking foolish, that's their character fear. But then they might dedicate their whole life to being all-knowing on a subject. So if I'm all-knowing on a particular subject, I can always focus on that and I can't look foolish. I'm always going to have the answer. So they become an expert in their profession. Or there's someone that might need to be, so the same fear of looking foolish, and the way they deal with that as a character is they always have to be right at any cost, even when they're wrong. So same fear, different expression of the character. Someone who fears losing control. Losing control and loss of control is a strong driving fear for a lot of humans. So they might become an obsessive compulsive type person with cleaning. So that's how they control their environment. Or maybe they're in relationships, they're domineering and controlling as well of the people that they're with. So again, same fear, different expression with your character. Fear of abandonment is always an interesting one if that drives a character. So if they have a fear of abandonment, maybe they never get into relationships. So they don't put themselves in a position. We often see this in love stories and rom-coms. They have a fear of abandonment and the whole story is about them learning to trust or not give in to that fear. Or if the fear of abandonment is they could get into relationships with people, but they're very cruel towards them. So they're always control, that kind of thing where they go, they're always in control and then they can't get abandoned because it's almost they're going to deliberately push that person away. So that's 2. Number 3, the third dimension is the positive traits and skills. So we've looked a little bit at what positive traits are, but the skills, so these are going to be the skills that they need to get through the story as well. So, if you're going to have, you look at Karate Kid where you got that example, that Johnny's the main rival or nemesis in the story. He's already a karate expert. So he's got those skills to start off. Danny at the start, there's that scene when he walks up to the new apartment and he kicks the door in and we get a little bit of a hint that he's done some martial arts training, but he really doesn't have a lot of those skills to get through the story, which he has to learn. But with certain characters, when we see Indiana Jones at the start, in the opening scenes, we see that his skills that, that he's smart and he's courageous, but he can think on his feet and he's really physical and great in any of those kind of really tough environments, but he's also scared of snakes. We get that all in about the first 7 or 8 minutes of the screenplay. So there'll be just some specific skills the characters are going to need to function in the story, but also you don't want to make them great at everything. That's one thing I want you to take away from this. It's, not everyone's good, not everyone's bad, but also I hate protagonists when I read screenplays and they're just great at everything when they need to be like that. And this is probably where the later Star Wars have struggled a bit with Rey in particular. If you have a look at Luke Skywalker struggles with mastering not only his temper, so, Luke Skywalker is very impulsive and impatient and has a temper, which he has to learn to control, and he has to learn how to develop as a Jedi, whereas Rey just kind of picks the skills up like that. So don't make them great at everything. That's a really important aspect. So I won't list it because I've already listed what some positive and negative traits are. So on Screenplay Method, I've got a huge list of stuff that I've gone through over time, but you can add to your list later. Negative traits and vices though. So we looked at some of those, but I just want to pick up on things like what are their temptations? And if they give in to them, what happens? So really looking at what tempts the character, because we all have different types of temptations. We won't all have the same, but I really like that it's thinking about, so it's not just negative traits, but what their vices are. simple things sometimes, for people, things like gambling or drinking. I remember watching years ago an episode of CSI. I haven't seen much of it, but there's a character, one of the detectives in that. There's a murder that happens at a casino, and it's really tough for him because he's got a gambling problem, and it's the sounds in a casino is what sets those vices off. So it's how does he manage dealing with his vice of gambling addiction whilst solving the case. So it's a really cool little kind of simple moment, but again, it gives a bit of depth to the character and dimension. And the classic things, what are people tempted by? Usually the opposite sex, drugs, alcohol, lack of responsibility.
Could we use I guess like Luke Skywalker as an example? What would you say his vice? Like he seems pretty straight arrow kind of.
He's someone who's I don't know if he has I guess vice is it's giving into anger, which we're going to look at it in the next bit of his character. Yeah. But he's someone, certainly his trouble or negative traits is that he is impulsive. He wants to learn quick, and he also has a lack of faith that he has in himself. If you have a look at that thread, it's really about him learning to believe in himself across those three films. And that's what becomes in Empire Strikes Back, he rushes off during his training to go and help his friends. So it's for an admirable reason, but and he quickly, his temper will get him into trouble even early in.
So it's kind of like the character's flaws in a way, not so much like
the flaws. Yeah, his other flaw will be we see how he's quick to anger when he first meets Han Solo, whereas Obi-Wan Kenobi is more measured. But I wouldn't say he has vices as such that I could think of in that context. So but other characters will have them. That will be their negative traits is vice-based around the traits. So number 5, so the 5th dimension I have of them is, what is the character's best self? And you're going to have this for both. You may not see it for your antagonist. You may, though. So what is it when they're at their best self? So, things like honesty, integrity, genuine relationships, loving,
loyalty,
or selfless loyalty. Yep. Now, in a story, we might see a character moving or working towards that. So we don't necessarily are going to get that all the way through. I'll look at an example on that in a moment once I do the next one, which is important. So the 6th one is, what is their worst self? So think about if they give in to their worst fears and their vices. So any character, and this is how we work as humans, given the circumstances, what can we slide in? What can we be at our best? And what can we be at our worst? And that's why we'll go back to Luke Skywalker as a good example. Essentially, the 3rd film becomes a battle between, will he be his best self, which is an honorable Jedi, or will he go to the dark side and be his worst self? So Luke Skywalker at his worst self can be exactly like his father, Darth Vader. He could be, if he gives into his anger and hatred, which we've set up in the first 2 films, if he gives into that, he will be someone who will be a violent dictator using his powers for evil. So he's got to make the choice between that. But very clearly we get to see what those 2 sides, his best self and his worst self. Obviously it'll depend a little bit on genre, but a really good example of this is Groundhog Day. Have you all seen Groundhog Day? With Bill Murray. So his character, he actually starts out as his worst self. So he is someone who is cynical, unloving, manipulative, and he doesn't have any genuine relationships in his life. So he's a deeply unhappy man. And essentially, the fear that's driving him in that is a fear of rejection and abandonment. So that, and then across the story, we see him go to be his best self. So his best self is someone who is genuine, loving, and he can be vulnerable with this the new woman that he's fallen in love with across the story. It's very clear we go, here's his best self and his worst self, and we've just seen that, and across all of those events, he arrives at that point. The opposite of that, because that's someone going from their best self to their worst self, the opposite of that is Brad Pitt in Seven, which is one of my favorite screenplays. So his best self is someone we see him as, he's a very hardworking detective, and he's very earnest. He wants to make a difference. And he has that debate with Morgan Freeman about 3/4 of the way through the film when they're in the bar, and he genuinely thinks he can make a difference. So his motives are very pure, if a little bit naive. But we see that he's a character, and he even says, I feed off my emotions. So when he kicks John Doe's door in, he feeds off his emotions. So he does have this temper, and right at the end, when we see him become his worst self, he does the worst possible thing, which is killing John Doe, but he's essentially given into his worst traits of a temper and feeding off his emotion. It's partly admirable because obviously his wife's been decapitated, but it's that trait that he kills John Doe, and he now becomes the worst possible version of himself. So that's the difference between up endings and down endings. An up ending, the character will end up being their best self, and a down ending, they'll be their worst self. And Godfather 2 is the other great example of that. Look at when Michael Corleone in the first Godfather, the first time we see him, he's like, I have no interest in my family's business. I'm not part of that. By the end of the second one, he's sitting by himself on a park bench, a hollowed out man, because not only has he become the Godfather, he has enacted the family code of loyalty to such an extreme that he can't compromise, that he kills his own brother. Have a look, that's his fall and his worst selves. It's an amazing character arc that we see. Again, it'll depend a little bit what your story and what your genre that you're working in. So with horror films, we tend not to see necessarily those aspects of the character. In Jaws, we see the different characters' traits, but it's really about surviving within the story. So this is one of the things you still want to go, how much do I need to shove this for the story that I'm writing? And I'll just go through what worst self could sort of be as a character. So this is someone who's, they could be bitter, angry, violent, addicted, could have fake relationships, or stuff like living to please others around them, so they're not being genuine. So I'm just going to wrap that up. I'm going to go through and just to give two character examples in a film that you can track with Misery for those who have seen. I know some of you have done my class, have seen Misery. Has everyone else, Neil and Patrick, have you?
Yes, I have.
Great film. And you probably know, I've sent a few blog posts out I've written on it because it's a film I really like and think's really well. But I'm just going to go through and go what the 6 character dimensions for both of those, the antagonist and the protagonist, to give you an example of how this plays out. So the protagonist is Paul Sheldon. So his presentation, so his first dimension, at the start, he's an easygoing and he's a rock and roll kind of guy. So he's got his, his cool car, and he uses his old leather bag that he puts his manuscript in, and he still types at a typewriter. And we learn a little bit more about some of his other traits, or how he comes across, which is someone who's polite and respectful. We learn about that a little bit later. We don't see it right at the start. So his fear, though, is being unfulfilled and unworthy, which he expresses in a scene indirectly with his age, and it's the 3rd scene of the film, because he's dissatisfied with aspects of his life. So his skills and positive traits, so he's smart, he's witty, he's a quick thinker, and he's good with his hands. And they show that there's the 2nd scene of the film when he picks up a snowball when he's leaving the retreat where he's written his screenplay, and he throws it and bang, he hits the tree. And then later we see him stuff like picking locks and all these little bits and pieces that he needs to do in the story. So it's something that's set up at the start, that he's a guy who is good with his hands, and he's dexterous and can do things, which is just really poor, because the other part is you don't want a skill to conveniently pop up later in the story. That's more a structural thing, which you look at when you're building your plotting, but you don't want a character to suddenly to be right at the end, they're suddenly really good at karate because they need to be able to, kick the baddie in the head to win the day or something. That's terrible writing. Don't do that. His trouble traits is that he's sarcastic and he's reckless, which we see in the start when he's driving his car. So he kind of gets himself into trouble. If he wasn't driving recklessly in a snowstorm up in the mountains, he never would have had the crash and put himself in that position. Which, Misery's it's essentially a thriller, but it's got some horror elements. And the key thing with that character is in a horror film is the protagonist always has to do something to somehow contribute to the horror of the situation they're in. So I was watching Psycho again last week, and if she doesn't steal that money, she doesn't end up at that hotel. Paul Sheldon doesn't drive recklessly in a storm. He doesn't have a crash and end up in Annie's house. And Ring, I was watching again a few weeks ago, the Japanese version. I've only watched the American one a couple of times. I don't remember it as well. But in the Japanese version of The Ring, there's even a point she's like, if I just hadn't watched that videotape, none of this would have happened. So that's an important character trait he has to have. His best self is someone who's selfless, because we get an idea that he's somewhat self-centered as a character. Someone who's grateful for the life that he has and that he's fulfilled. Now, his worst self, which is really interesting, is his worst self is because we actually see it in the climax of the story. He tries everything to solve his problem. And at the end, his worst self he falls into, which is violent, angry, and bitter. And that is essentially he has to kill Annie to survive himself. So he slides into that, but then we see that last little scene at the end when he actually realized that he's someone who's become grateful for the life that he has in that final little scene at the restaurant. So it's not, he slid down into that moment, but then he ascends again, and it's only because he had no other choice. He tried everything else. So we go, that's not the core of him. It's just that's his potential. Okay, and Annie as the antagonist is one of the best antagonists written, and she's actually got a lot more depth going on than Paul Sheldon's character in the story. So Annie's presentation at the start is that she's matronly, so in the way she dresses, it's very different to Paul. So she looks like the nurse, it's sort of a nurse and a nun at the same time. She's a cross as well that she's wearing. And she's strange and odd. This comes through early, that she's just your initial thing when you go, this woman's a bit odd and strange how she sort of talks and acts. But also she's caring. So the first time we're seeing her, she saves Paul's life and she has cared for him as a nurse in her home. So again, she's not all bad at the start. And this is that good writing when I talked about, we kind of go, she's a bit odd, but she's caring and she's going to look after him and bring him back to life. And then, like I said, across the story, we learn what the true nature of her character is. So her fear is being abandoned and unloved, which she talks about a few times. So when her marriage ends, and that she says, you'll never know what it will be like for me to have to lose someone like you. So it's a key character trait, this fear of abandonment. And that's why she obsessively throws herself into it's the love she gets is from reading the Misery books. So her skills and abilities, so she's obviously a very good nurse. She's able to patch a very broken up guy by herself, just improvising with stuff in her house. She's a quick thinker herself, so she adapts to these situations that come up in the story. Because remember, your protagonist has a goal in the story, but so does your antagonist. So Paul's goal is to escape. Annie's is to keep him. So whenever he tries to escape, she has to adjust. And she's also passionate as a character. It's a really interesting character trait that Annie had. Like the music and the books that she doesn't like stuff, she loves it. So she's really, passionate woman. So her trouble traits, it can be quite a list for this character. But her key ones is she has a quick temper. She's a liar. She's manipulative, and she's controlling. And she also has, her vice is more that she's a tendency towards mental illness. Not only is she a sociopath, but depression and those sorts of things. So her best self, and this is a really good way to look at with your antagonist, with your best self, is it's if they had the traits they had, if they used them for good instead of evil. You know, so Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader are that kind of thing. It's like Darth Vader and it could be like Luke Skywalker if you used his traits for good. So with Annie, she's someone like that. It's like her best self is she could be someone who's very, you know, she's caring and very helpful and helping others. That's the kind of stuff she can be doing if she was using those skills in a hospital which she used to work, but instead she uses them to kill babies and stuff like that in hospitals. But we still go, she could be probably a great nurse that could be one of those head nurses in a hospital that could really help teaching younger nurses because she knows her stuff well. Her worst self, which is what we see her for big chunks of the film, is that she's, you know, a murderer. She's violent and cruel. A sociopath, essentially. She's a great character, and that's why actors love playing, you know, the villain or the baddie, because there's so much fun to play around in a role like that. Just before we go into some questions, the last point I want to leave you with, these are all the ways of your defining the character. The most important question to answer when developing your character is, how does my character go about trying to achieve their goal? That will define them more than anything. And that's going to be connected to everything we talked about. So I'll say it again, how does my character go about achieving their goal? And you look at any films you like and you just watch that and you answer that question to yourself. How is it they go about that? Because that will define their true character. So, okay, I'm just going to... Okay, so if there was any questions on any of that or other character stuff, try to just sort of go one at a time. So, hang on, you're on mute.
I'm on mute.
Okay,
Sorry.
there we go. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I'm writing as I'm talking, so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that okay if I go first?
Yeah, go for it. Jump in.
Everybody is okay with that? Okay.
All friends.
I have a challenge in my story, and that is that the antagonist, at least at first, is an unknown party that's making things difficult for the protagonist. Yep. And I'm speaking in very general terms here.
Yeah, please do.
So I know as the writer who they are and what they're doing. But the person who's experiencing the story doesn't. So I have all the traits, I have all the specifics in my head about that antagonist, but they're not apparent for some time in the story. And is that a problem? Because it's not, it's not defining them early on. They're actually an unknown source that's interfering with the main character's journey.
Okay. Two questions I have on that. At what stage, just in the story, do we learn that we see the antagonist? Approximately.
It's pretty well into the story, and that may actually be a problem. Just thinking out loud here, but there's a series of things that happen, and it's actually quite well into the story, like past the midway mark.
Okay.
Which you're probably saying that's a sign of an amateur, but I got some work to do on it.
It'll depend. So the other question is, even though we're not seeing them, what they're doing off screen, is that having an effect on the main character? Absolutely.
Very, very obvious effect.
Yeah, that's fine then. So the example I would use for that, so we won't go into particulars on your screenplay, just because of copyright stuff.
Right.
But You've seen Seven? Are you one of the people who?
Oh, of course, yes.
Yeah, we don't meet John Doe until the third act climax. Sorry, third or second act, depending if you see it as a 3 or 4 act structure film. But when John Doe gives himself up, but we see his work all the way through and how he's impacted.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
no problem. I mean, it's one of my favorite scenes when he gives himself up in Seven. I'll never forget that moment in the cinema. It's
Covered in blood in the police station.
yeah, he's just like, detective. It's an amazing scene because it's just like, whoa, what is going on? But John Doe we know as a person, and we learn about his traits through the detective work. So we obviously see how he kills, and then when Morgan Freeman's reading, when they find his apartment and Morgan Freeman's reading through one of his books with all his rantings, we learn key little bits about his character. So the main thing is, as long as your antagonist is affecting directly your protagonist's goal, then we don't have to be seeing them.
Okay. That's and I'm glad you gave me that example of Seven, because I'm very familiar with that. And you're right. I mean, we see his work that keeps the two detectives going in their goal, but we don't really get to know him fully till well into the story.
Yeah.
It's almost the climax of the story. That's way down the road. So.
Yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head the exact, but he probably comes in at about an hour 45 of 2 hours and 7 minutes or something like that. It's very late in the piece, but we have a very good picture of him leading to that, and then we learn a lot more. So great, that sounds really interesting as a project. That because it's a little bit, it's not the most standard approach to doing it, but as long as it's affecting the antagonist, the protagonist, it's fine. So it sounds really
okay. Well, I appreciate that, yeah, because I've been wondering if I'm making a mistake, but you gave me a great example that I'm very familiar with, and that's actually quite a great film, quite a great script. So, yeah.
My top couple of films of all time. I love it. So,
but just to add to that, the way he, out of the blue, turns himself into the police station and he's covered in blood. I mean, couldn't be more guilty. Later on, Brad Pitt says, "We got you," and he basically says, "How did you get me? I walked in, and I turned myself into you. You did all these things, and you never got me." That was just a great, sort of turn on the antagonists too, because they only achieved their goal because he let them.
Absolutely, and that is a great observation. That's one of the geniuses of the story, because as good a detective as both of those men are, and they're both very good detectives in different ways, they still actually, the question is, would have they solved it or not in the end?
The champ won the wrestling match because the opponent just went limp and gave in. It wasn't that he was the champ and he was that great.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a stunning film. Yeah.
So, thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Any other questions?
Very helpful. You answered the other one earlier, so appreciate that.
Great. Anyone else out there with some questions?
Well, I was thinking about questions like, in Star Wars is a great example, because I emailed you a question about like why you think maybe, I guess, a lot of modern characters aren't as memorable as they are. Because I mean, everyone can remember Luke Skywalker and stuff, but I don't think in 20 years we're going to be talking about Rey from the modern one. Like it just, I saw that last movie. It was shocking, especially when you compare it to the original ones in terms. Even now, I think more about the storytelling since working with yourself and stuff. It just felt like very convenient. Everything that happened was like just so like obviously laid out, or they had a skill. I think at one point they needed to get out of a cave. I can't remember it too well. Like, and that's the thing, I can't remember this movie, whereas everything from the original was like etched in my mind. They had to get out of a cave, and then all of a sudden she can use the Force to heal creatures and stuff. And you're like, what? That's never happened in any of them before. Like, it's just, weird.
Yeah, I haven't seen that. I've only seen the first of the new ones. So, but I have heard of all of that sort of stuff. And
the last one's worse than that one. Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah, I actually saw it. The first one was in LA several years years ago, and I felt a little bit guilty because it's the Man Chinese Cinema where the first one screened, and it was famous for people queuing up around the block, and George Lucas and his wife were having dinner and walked past. I said, "Oh, what's everyone queuing up for?" Like Star Wars. And I was in LA, and for 6 days I saw people lined up for the premiere of this, and it was kicking off at 8 o'clock, and I went up at 7, and I went, so when are tickets available later in the week? And the woman went, we got some still for the premiere. And I was like, oh, sweet, I'll go. And I felt bad because I had to wait 1 hour and people sat there for 7 days.
I remember a funny thing just on that note as well. Like I'm a school teacher and I work with like grade 5, 6, and they're like 11 years old. And this kid in my class, he was mad into Star Wars and he had this collection of Star Wars cards. And I'm like, oh yeah, tell me about the characters. And like this kid who's 11 in 2020 knows everything about the original trilogy characters. Oh, this is Han Solo, this is Boba Fett, and this kind of stuff. And he got up to one of the characters from, and I never saw the movie, but it's from that one called, you know how they did those kind of side story movies?
Yeah.
I think it was called
Rogue One and stuff like that.
Rogue One. Rogue One. And I go, oh, who's that character? And he goes, and he couldn't tell me the name, didn't know anything about him. And he was like one of the lead characters in Rogue One. And I just noted that was interesting. Even, we all remember those original ones, but like nothing's really resonating with us from the new ones.
Yeah, and kids will get, we understand storytelling from a young age, and really, to sum all that up, the problem is that she's good at everything and she has no flaws. Yeah. And I would say that description for any character is a big problem. Well, it doesn't matter what story that is. It really comes down to because it's all about struggle. The character's got to struggle to achieve their goal.
Yeah, exactly.
And I also know that has some inconsistencies of how the Force is used, which is poor writing, because the key is you've got the story world and the rules, and you need to kind of stick with them. And in the first 3, we clearly understand how the Force works, and in those ones, it's chop and change.
Yeah, like it's
midichlorians.
Sorry, was that Petra?
I'm sorry, I said midichlorians. Where did this blood test come from to see if you're a Jedi? You take a simple blood test and, oh yeah, you're a Jedi.
Yeah.
High level of, it took all the mystery out of it, didn't it?
Well, you notice in those prequel movies how they dropped that whole idea in the second 2 of the prequel films. It never came up again, It
was a mistake.
I do really like the first 3. I'm not a huge Star Wars nut, but I do really enjoy the first 3. And yeah, they are classic characters that everybody remembers. And as an interesting character study, I don't know if you know, it's called Red Letter Media. YouTube, and they've done these really long analysis of the 3 prequels when they came out. And there's a really good bit if you want to look at character. If you watch the first one, I think it was Phantom Menace, on Red Letter Media's channel. They ask people to describe Han Solo, the character, Han Solo and Luke.
Allowed to say what they look like.
Obi-Wan, but you're not allowed to say what they look like, and what their position is. And people can do it for all of those. And then they said, now do it for Phantom Menace. And they go, you can't describe any character in that really apart from how they look and what the position, they go, they're a Jedi, or it's a queen, or she's beautiful. Whereas Han Solo, it's kind of like, he's a rebel, he's roguish, he's, really confident. All of these traits, but he's selfish. He looks out for himself. I've just come up with 5, 6 of his traits like that. So it's a really good exercise for that. But he's actually a good one. We see him, they're his trouble traits, and then by the end of it, he becomes, what his best self is. So he becomes selfless and helps out, sacrificing for others. So again, that's why his character's got a really good dimension. Any other stuff? Neil, did you have any questions?
Well, you mentioned some of your favorite movies, and like maybe mention a few others that it would be great to watch.
Okay.
Or study.
That would be a long list. I'll give it a couple of, ones that I really like. Silence of the Lambs. I really like detective stories. I watched that again last year and absolutely love Silence of the Lambs. Horror stuff, a really big horror fan. So I watched Psycho again last week. that's a really good example of presentation and reality. Norman Bates is, I mean, sociopaths in real life, you don't know that they're sociopaths.
Yeah.
So Norman Bates, what we meet and what we learn, I mean, that's got the two reveals about his character. It's a magnificent story in the way that kind of plays out. I mean, different ones. I don't know if anyone's seen it. One of my favorite films, an Italian film called The Conformist, which is by...
Il Conformist, yeah, absolutely.
Who's seen that? Please.
Is it Bertolucci?
Bertolucci, 1970s, and Vittorio Storaro was a cinematographer who went on to do stuff like Apocalypse Now and lots of things with the Last Emperor. It's an amazing film and a beautiful piece of writing because it uses that shuffled narrative. So I won't spoil it, but if you can find that, it's just a beautiful piece of storytelling. God, there's so many which I could. You did Ring, the Japanese horror film. That's good. Another great one I love watching, I think, is the characters and the plot is The Sting, which is the old, with Newman and Redford. If you haven't seen that, go and say it's a great study in plotting a story, but also the character development in that's really good. And they do it. The other really important thing when it's a buddy story is they contrast the characters. So they're quite different people. So if you're ever writing a buddy story, don't make them the same. Because that's where you get your contrast and your conflict from it. Lots of other... One I was watching recently, I really like, is a Danish film called The Vanishing. It's made in the early 90s. It was remade America did a remake. Don't watch it because they changed some key stuff that really, really kind of ruins essentially the point of the story. It's a magnificent character study of the antagonist in that is amazing. TV series, if you're looking at character studies, The Wire would be my favorite TV series. That's a really good example of your protagonists are very flawed people. Very complex characters. To me, it's the best TV show, and certainly as character study as well. I'll have to email some more around. I said the list could go on and on. I mean, recently, Apocalypse Now, they had I don't know if anyone saw the director's cut that came out of Apocalypse Now.
Yep.
Which is great.
Which, the 2000 one or the one that just came out?
The one that just came out 2019. Still not sure it's the best version of it, but it's got some superfluous scenes in it for sure. Yeah, it's better than the Read. Have you seen the Redux though? Because that's way too long. Yeah. I still think for me the first 2/3 of Apocalypse Now are just it's a masterpiece. It's epic poetry, really. And it's like the Odyssey or something. I agree. Yeah, it's amazing, and I'm just not sure when it gets to Kurtz's compound, it seems to lose it a little bit. But also in high school, Hearts of Darkness was my favorite novel. So when I found out Apocalypse Now was essentially inspired by that. Yeah. That's actually a good example too of another character that we get to know them along the way through a dossier, through reading notes and photos and things like that. But we don't actually meet them till, well into the last act, basically. Yeah, that's a great example, but we seem like...
I gotta go, guys. I'll see you next time, but thanks so much, David.
Okay, I was just going to say, wrapping up, I'll send an email around, Daryl, because you've joined in on this. The next 48 hours, you can have, it's $100 off any product if you want on Screenplay Method, if it's script feedback or any of the courses or whatever. I'll shoot you an email to follow that up, but thanks for coming along, Daryl, and good to hear that you're still working on your features. So
yeah, we'll do. I'll keep you posted. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, mate. Sorry to cut that. Yeah, if you haven't seen Apocalypse Now, that is a good example of we learn a lot. And Willard's a pretty dark character himself. Yeah. Kilgore to me makes the film. The sequence with Kilgore, which is the brash military, he's flying the helicopters or whatever. Yeah. Played by Robert Duvall he's just one of my all-time favorite characters. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you get a character who things are exploding around him and everyone's hitting the deck and he just keeps on talking like he didn't notice. This is one of the first things you notice about him. That's a confident mother right there. Yeah.
You know, he's just completely unfazed by ordnance exploding around him, and everyone's just keeps hitting the deck, incoming, you know, and it's just, yeah, that is a interestingly drawn character right there.
Yeah. He's a fascinating, again, if you go through his traits and stuff like that, but also what's great about him, you know, he's kind of brash, but he cares about his soldiers. There's that great line when they're in that attack and he's like, I want my men straight out away who've been injured. So he cares about them and they care about him. And yeah, he's a fascinating character, and Deville is just perfect.
Absolutely. It's got like, yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to have to wrap up in a moment, but was there any other questions for him, Cheryl, or anyone else?
Yeah, no, it's pretty good. I think it's been just a good reminder. I mean, I guess I'm working at it from a different angle too. I'm coming back. You know, my characters are real historical people, but I've got to sort of draw out from all that I know, and I know a lot about some of them and very little about others. But I've got to, you know, I think just shaping them in the book, you know, in terms of these dimensions and things like that, will, you know, gives me an idea of how to highlight what to highlight, what to focus on. So that's been great. Oh, great! Yeah. Project, you know, different genres and projects will have different requirements on what you have to do, and the tough bit when you're doing a true story is how you develop the characters and keeping them real, but making them work as drama characters. That's right. So that's my challenge, I guess. Yeah. Great. Keep working at those projects. So. Great. Well, thanks for coming along to that. It was lots of fun. So it was terrific. If you have any follow-up questions, just email them through, and hopefully we can do some more of these down the track. So great idea. Yeah, it's really effective.
Thank you so much. Very helpful. Very appreciated.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thanks. And nice to meet you, Neil and Patrick, because the other guys have all taught in courses, but good to meet both of you. So
it's a pleasure. Hope to see you again.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much for that. I've had a ball. I'll catch you later.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.